good evening. We're glad that you could join us for what we believe to be a history-making radio documentary on the 1947 Woodward Tornado. This radio special is brought to you on K-101 radio by Irwin Chevrolet Oldsmobile Cadillac of Woodward, Western Oklahoma Wholesale Antenna, Trigo's Men's Store, Northwest Equipment of Woodward, and Jim's Auto Salvage. These fine merchants are proud to be a part of this feature and to support this type of broadcast, which adds significantly to our heritage in Northwest Oklahoma. These recollections of that fateful night in April 37 years ago are nevertheless true life experiences about a killer tornado that took lives and destroyed property. Some material contained herein is shocking, morbid, and frightening. But so is April 9th, 1947 for Woodward, Oklahoma. Our program will begin after this word.
Most Americans recall where they were on December 7th, 1941, or even November 22nd, 1963. Those, of course, the dates of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Citizens of this area, particularly those over 40, add April 9th, 1947 to the list of dates they remember. Here, all events are classified as happening before or after the tornado. April 9th, 1947, dawned cloudy and cool with a humid, sticky feeling. The day is remembered as strange, foreboding. It was the kind of weather school teachers and mothers dread, when restless children foretell changing weather patterns by their behavior.
Hey, this is Bonnie Reed speaking. I remember very clearly that the whole day had been strange. The color was odd, and there was a closeness, and it was sort of hard to breathe. And the wind and the dirt had blown all day. And that evening we had a terrible electrical storm and more winds and rain. And all that day we noticed how strange the birds were acting. And they were all flying northeast, and a lot of people had commented on that. And that day my aunt's cats kept trying to get their kittens in the house. And it seemed like that they really knew that something was going to happen.
Franklin Stetcher adds,
the first I noticed the evening was the color of the sky, an orange color. And as the night came on, it became more prominent.
The Woodward Daily Press that day carried a forecast for showers and thunderstorms with moderate to heavy amounts of rain this afternoon, tonight, and Thursday. The spring's weather had already produced severe storms across the nation, and the press had carried page one telephotos of tornado damage in El Dorado Springs, Missouri, and Poto, Oklahoma.
By dusk, the sun made an appearance just above the horizon and beneath the lifting clouds. Little did anyone realize the horror that was about to take place, for in the west a new dark bank of clouds was building. These distant clouds were not to the immediate concern of those folks in Woodward. Some banks always appear darker in the western sky at sunset. In this prairie country, thunderheads, as they're sometimes called, are visible for long distances. Woodward was over 150 miles away from the beginning of the core of this new storm. It was Charlie Thompson, working at White Deer, Texas, on a Fisher grain elevator under construction just north and east of Amarillo, just after 5 p.m. that evening, who first saw the tornado form.
The Woodward Tornado started at White Deer, Texas. It at approximately 5 in the afternoon. L.S. Fisher Grain Company and Construction Company from Woodward was pulling an elevator there at that time. There were 29 or 30 men on top of the elevator at that time, and the funnel dropped from a cloud and hit in a water hole or a lake about a mile or a mile and a half southwest. It sucked water just like a straw, just like a giant straw. We could see it go from the bottom to the top. It appeared it was going north of us at that time, and everyone went to the west side of the platform or top of the green concrete, which 80 feet in the air at that time, to watch the funnel. It went to a farmhouse and buildings of which raised up in the air, and I don't know how high before they appeared to explode. one woman was killed at that house. Freight train on the track, the west end between the elevator and the farmstead, and 21 cars on the tail end of the train were blown from the track. It appeared to be headed straight at us at that time. The darndest scramble for the ladder in the center of the elevator to get down you ever did see. 8 of us remained on top as it was too late to go down. Shorty Jones, Hal Boatman, Charlie Thompson, Camargo, Ward Wingo, 2 of the Bailey brothers from Visine, Big Hank Swartz from Woodward, and at this time I can't remember the name of the other. The storm made a whistling sound. It got so loud and so high-pitched, shrill that we couldn't hear. It missed us something like 100 yards to the north. We were looking right down into a terrific whirlwind. It raged as it went by. We went back to work pulling the elevator in about 30 minutes. We had no idea the destruction that was ahead later that evening. Just Charlie Thompson, Camargo.
Some people anticipated a big blow from the feel of the day, but apparently very few had changed their evening plans. Old-timers probably reflected that it was the month when anything might happen. 2 of the most memorable weather-related incidents had taken place in April. One was the dust storm of April 1935, the worst of the Depression dusters, and it is known in history as Black Sunday. On April 5th, 1938, a massive snowstorm dumped tons of the white stuff on the country. April 9th, 1947, would seem of little importance.
Roughly paralleling the Santa Fe tracks, the storm headed towards Pampa. It could have easily been followed and its destructive path predicted, but there was no warning, as there was no national severe warning system in effect. By 6 o'clock, Pampa was safe when the tornado swung to the north and away from the railroad, and then circled back to resume its path of destruction along the twin rails. The first town to be badly hit was Glacier, Texas. Not a building of the 25 structures that once made up this town was standing. All were leveled by the terrific force of the tornado that struck about 7 p.m. that Wednesday evening. Glacier is about 10 miles north and east of Canadian and about 100 miles north and east of Amarillo. In Higgins, just 15 miles on up the highway, 9 members of the Litchfield family were at home.
This is Leela Litchfield in Higgins, Texas. The house was completely destroyed except for the foundation. All the furniture was gone with the wind. All the family was within a few feet of each other after the house blew away.
Meanwhile, at the Higgins Hospital, Ruth Spivell was recovering from giving birth to her new son 4 days earlier.
On the evening of April 9th, the 600-mile-an-hour tornado roared into Higgins and destroyed much of the town in a duration of some 20 long minutes. I, nor anyone at the hospital, were hurt. The electricity went off, and then all of the windows of the hospital blew in. The noise was deafening and sounded like being near a railroad track with many freight trains passing by. Buildings were burning and fireballs were seen out the window, and not realizing that it was a storm, I thought the world was coming to an end.
In the Bible Belt, Wednesday night traditionally has meant church activities, and Woodward's 16 churches all held evening services that night. For 500 people not inclined for midweek religion, movie theaters offered, ironically, Devil on Wheels at the Terry Theater and Rage in Heaven at the Woodward. Some moviegoers would never know the details of those Hollywood tragedies, for at that point, the storm was now 35 miles away, traveling at 45.6 miles per hour on its journey northeastward towards Woodward. It was still gaining in momentum and fury as it crossed the Oklahoma border southwest of Shattuck. It was now just after 8 o'clock. No official warning had been issued to any of the towns in its path, but the storm's roar at Shattuck was so distinctive that a telephone operator there called the Woodward operator to ask, "Are you all right?" At 8 p.m. when that call was made, the answer was yes. Only emergency telephone operators were on duty, as the nation was in its third day of a nationwide telephone strike. Grace Nix, chief operator at Woodward, and Bertha Wiggins, evening chief operator, had a second call just after 8 o'clock from operator at Cestus, a little town east of Isi and just southeast of Woodward. The woman began, "There's a dark cloud over Woodward. It looks terrible." The women did not know that the storm had already slashed through Gage, Oklahoma, only 25 miles from Woodward. It was now just after 8:15.
Like R.A. Mitchell of Gage, storm area residents who escaped the wind's destructive fury turned first to rescue of debris-trapped relatives and neighbors. Mitchell aided in digging out the body of Elmer Harmon, middle-aged farmer living 2 miles south of Gage, from the wreckage of the Harmon farm home. Harmon's body, still warm according to newspaper accounts, was literally wrapped around the crumpled base of a brick chimney when discovered. The storm passed southeast of Gage, where a CAA radio station was at first the area's only link with the outside world. One account by TWA pilot Joe Imeson of Kansas City flew a Mercy flight from Wichita to the Gage airport, told of a family near Gage that was literally dropped into the basement below their house when the raging winds literally blew the home off their heads.
This is Ron Stoner. On April 9th, 1947, as a child of 8 years of age, I was on Main Street at Fargo, and a boy about my age, by the name of Leroy Fenimore, came running down the street yelling, "We're going to have a tornado. Yippee, we're going to have a tornado." And some of the people started getting excited and getting in the cars and hurrying away. So I ran home, which was about 1/2 mile from town, and asked my mother what a tornado was, because at the time I didn't know. She explained to me that it was like a cyclone, but sometimes worse. I had heard about cyclones, so I then had an idea what it was. So we went outside and started looking at clouds. It was just before dark there at Fargo. It wasn't storming at the time, it was just cloudy. But in a few minutes things changed and it got stormy, and looking from our house we could see dark low clouds south of us, and we could see what looked like a large whirlwind with dirt and debris flying in the air. We watched it go from the west to the east. We lost electricity and couldn't hear the radio, but later that night my grandfather, who lived about 1/2 mile down the road, came to our house and told us that he had heard over the battery radio that a tornado had hit Woodward.
Alan Aaron was the superintendent of schools at the Tangier High School in 1947. He had just finished a school board meeting and had invited one of the school board members, Henry Reith, home to the teacherage. All at once, he relates, the house began to shake and tremble, the windows rattled, and the whole house was shaking. We first thought it was a double-header freight train going through. In those days, steam engines can make a lot of noise coming up that steep grade from Woodward to Tangier, so we dismissed the incident, thinking it was just another train. It turned out that the vibrations of our home, trembling as it were, was not a train at all, but the tornado passing only a mile south. Dr. Joe Durer was a resident physician at Woodward's Hospital. We pick up our story with Dr. Durer just before the storm moved into Woodward, around 8:30 p.m.
Well, there was a storm coming. I didn't give it any consideration being a tornado, and wasn't then ignorant about tornadoes. I'd been in and around a dozen or more in my lifetime. But I got home and we had painters at the house, and wife hadn't cooked, so we was going to go out to dinner, and I wasn't very good humor about that, being late, and told her the storm coming up, and I hadn't made my hospital rounds. So anyway, we went down to we thought we'd go to the Oasis. We changed our mind, and we went down to Gill's Cafe, which was right across the street from the hospital, or the post office, where the old post office was. The school administration building now. We went in there, and it became pretty obvious to me that there was storms coming up, and the lights went out. There's one thing I recall. Gil, just before the lights went out, he had one of the Gillen boys, he had a barometer hanging up there, and he said, I heard him say, "My God, look at that barometer." And just hadn't much more than said that. I never got to see the barometer. The lights went out. But he said it went clear to the bottom. When they did, I got up and went to the window, and then I was aware that we were in a tornado because of the sound. A tornado makes a peculiar humming sound. If you ever been in the middle of one, paid attention to it, why, besides all the other noise, the wind has a peculiar humming song to it that you don't get anywhere else. I guess just because it's such a high wind. So I went back, and my wife said, "What's going on?" And I said, "There's a tornado." And I said it loud enough, I wanted everybody to hear it. I said, "Get down under those tables and stay there." So, but I got back to the window, and then I saw this other phenomena that I'd never seen before because it's never been in the same circumstances. Looking up the main street to the west, it looked like the whole street was full of fire, about 4 feet deep. That's the way it looked. It was lit up so bright, and that was being caused by rocks and pieces of metal and nails and what have you being hitting on the pavement and making sparks off the pavement. But it was just a glow. And of course, a terrific noise. And just about the time I got up there then, the window went out. And I didn't get struck by even just a little bit of glass. It was all out in the street. The suction took it out. I was right in the middle of it. Then of course, immediately, why, things began to subside, and I knew that it was over. From the time the lights went out until I went back and told the folks, I said, "It's all over now. We just want to go home." I would guess it was. I'm certain it wasn't 5 minutes. I doubt it was over 3 minutes. I told the folks who were going home, and Gil hollered at me and he said, "Don't go out there, Doc, there's hot wire." And I told him, "Hell, there ain't no hot wire in town." I knew every wire had to be down and the power's out, and there wasn't no hot wire. It couldn't be. Within 3 minutes more, we'd gone out to our car. Both cars, there was a car on each side of us. And both cars on each side of us were flat or crushed. But our car was not. It wasn't hurt a bit. The only thing, it had sticks sticking up out of the joints where they stuck in there. You couldn't pull out without breaking them off. Some of them to 16, 18 inches long. But we got right in the car, started up, and drove out. But we had to drive over lumber and everything else, just fight our way out and to get home, and went on home. And of course, in the buildings were in around from there on home on South 9th Street where we lived. Those buildings always battered up, and we didn't go right past the back of the schoolhouse. The schoolhouses were battered. We could see that roofs were down and off and everything like that, but not to that extent. And I knew without question that there was going to be some casualties, whether there's deaths or just battered and bruised. It couldn't help but be. I told my wife I'd better get on to the hospital.
It's now a few minutes before 9 o'clock on April 9th, 1947. The Woodward tornado is over for Woodward. The story of that tornado, as told by those who lived through it, will continue after this message.
Didn't get my supper. I hadn't made my hospital rounds, but as I told her, I said, we'll probably have some casualties, some injuries out there to take care of. I better get out there. And so I couldn't quite conceive of, I guess I hadn't given it a lot of thought. But on my way to the hospital, I thought about it a little bit more, and I went in, and Dr. Darwin and Dr. England were sewing up a gash on a fellow's head. Been right there on the street, not very far from the hospital, and got struck with something, cut his head. They brought him in there, and they were sewing him up. I told these fellows, I said, you better get on the ball. You're going to have more work than you know what to do with. And they said, well, you don't think it's that bad, do you? And I said, no, it just took off the west side of town, was all, because as I said, I'd been thinking about it, and I realized that it just about had to take off a heck of a chunk out there, some down through there. And but I still was not, I was just surmising, you might say. And I hadn't more than said that till the door opened, and it never went shut again. As they began to bring in the people. You couldn't even recognize people. They looked like they'd been rolled in mud. Not all of them, but many of them did. And of course, along with those, there was fractures and other things that due to being blown into things, and things blown into them and falling on them and such. We had all those kind. The more serious injuries, they were all people that needed attention, some kind or another. And all ages, old people and young people, infants and children and what have you, and all kinds of injuries. Primarily, you can say the primary injuries were puncture wounds, put it that way, splinters and boards driven through people, and things of that kind. One woman handed me a little child and said, look at that. And it was just about like handing me a cockleburr, so many splinters sticking out in the child. It died. It wasn't then, but it died later. One of our local men had a one before driven through his arm. They had to saw it off to get him in the house. So the warden do. And there's one woman that's been put in across the street, and they called somebody come over there, and I went over and looked at her. They had 3 or 4 over there. But this woman was dying. She'd been struck in the pelvis where they looked like a 2x4 going right up through her. And of course she died within a few minutes after I was there. In fact, I asked Howard Boatman was wanting to work, you know. He was wanting, what could he do? And I told him to get 3 or 4 men and get pick up or anything and carry these dead people out and take them to the mortuary. They were just taking up space. And so Howard Boatman took charge of that, and I know they took out 12 at one time. But it was extremely dirty. That was where we ran into trouble right away. Then we had this fire down there, and of course the fire department had to go out and take care of that. And the first thing they know, our water went off. Our first order of business was to get water. You couldn't clean things up. You couldn't flush the toilets. You couldn't do nothing. That stops the progress. That's one thing in those kinds of, especially in the hospital setup, they need an auxiliary water supply just as bad as they need auxiliary power.
In less than 5 minutes, the funnel crossed the town on a southeast to northwest diagonal, ripping through 200 blocks. Total darkness came at 8:43 when the funnel hit the power plant at the north edge of town. Inside the building, Irwin Walker had just come on duty. It is believed that Walker pulled a master switch as the storm slammed into the building, killing him. His action meant that a down power line would not bring additional deaths. Water began to fall in sheets. Survivors of the storm recall the darkness of the night, broken only by candles, flashlights, and lightning streaks.
Everyone living in the area then had a story to tell about that night and the days following. Ron Stoner is first.
We went to Woodward to see something that I could never forget. As we were coming up the big hill just west of Woodward, I saw the first evidence of the tornado. There was what looked like a broomstick. It was sticking out of the power line post close to the top of the post, and it had a chicken with it. Most of the feathers plucked out attached to it.
This is L.O. Spray, and I was 13 years old when the tornado hit Woodward. We lived a half mile west of the Y, west of town. When it hit, we were kind of in the backdraft of it, I guess. It was more or less south of us, but there's a deafening roar, and there seemed to be a lot of pressure on your ears. Then we tried to get out of the house. Well, a brooder house had been scooted right up next to our back door, so we had to go out the front door. And we had about 200 white-legged chickens scattered all the way up toward town, and it made kind of a white trail up to Dr. Whiteneck's house east of us. The tornado came across Experiment Lake, it lowered the lake about a foot, they said, and it scattered mud as it went over Woodward. Well, we saw a lot of fires in town, so we jumped in old 41, my mom and my dad and my sister and I. We went to check on my grandparents, Sam and Jesse Smith, and we made it all the way down through the main street. It was just covered with debris, but somewhere or another we made it down through there. When we got down there, they were asleep. Didn't know there'd even been a storm. We saw a truck. It had a fire underneath the truck, and there were people huddled in under it. It was the Sam Catlett family. And they were pretty well beat and battered and had compound fractures, and they were wrapped in old muddy blankets and quilts, and they were scratched and beat. A lot of them didn't have any clothes on, and they were just wrapped in blankets is all they had. We took them to the Woodward Hospital. The hospital was already full. There were people out on the lawn screaming, and there was a lot of panic, and some were covered with sheets and blankets. So we went on over to the Moreland Hospital, and we got them right in over there. And we understood that Sam Catlett died about 30 minutes after we got over there. We went to this funeral home. Our folks didn't want us to go in, but we wanted to go in with them. We went in there, and there was, I think it was Mason Funeral Home. There were probably 50 victims laying there with just sheets covering them, and their feet and their heads were sticking out. And my dad would say, "Well, there's so-and-so," because we knew everybody in town. That's where we found our cousin. And me being 13 years old, of course, I'd never seen anything like that, and hope never to again.
Bonnie Reed adds,
That night the electricity kept going off, and finally it went off, and it stayed off. And then the winds increased, and then the terrible noise started. And it's a noise that, once you hear it, you never forget it. It sounded like a lot of trains. The front lawn of the hospital had been made into a temporary morgue. We didn't realize that there had been people killed and so many people hurt. You talk about funny things happening in a tornado. There was nothing left of their house except the cement step. But the milk bottle that she had set out that night for milk delivery the next morning was still sitting on the step where she had put it.
And there were other tales of the storm's capricious nature. Another example of this was the story told by Lois Shepard, who was badly injured in the storm. She had a pickle crock stored outside her home. The storm turned the crock upright before filling it with bricks from the chimney, all without damaging the container.
Before long, there was another source of light illuminating the horror of the night as 4 North Side businesses went up in flames: the Big 7 Electric Company, the Big 7 Hotel, Armour Creamery, and Rainey Davis Wholesale Company. The glow of these fires alerted Moreland residents 10 miles east that something was wrong in Woodward. While most people looked only to their immediate surroundings, others realized that word must be gotten to the outside. But with phone lines down, it was necessary for L.L. Orrell, telephone wire chief, and Carl Brown to trace the lines to a point 3 miles south of Woodward, where they were able to flash word to the Oklahoma City Test Board. In Woodward, 8 of the striking telephone workers reported to duty working through the night by kerosene lantern. These Woodward operators would receive national criticism from union officials for their decision to report to work that night. A representative from the union arrived in Woodward within a week to chastise the girls and order them off the job. The operators resigned from the union and would not again rejoin that union for 2 years. Word of the storm was also relayed to Sealing by Highway Patrolman Jim Holland. He called for extra patrol, nurses, doctors, and other emergency services. And Herman Sauls drove from Woodward to Sealing to call for Red Cross assistance. The story of the Woodward Tornado will continue after these messages.
My name's Marlene Harrington,
And I'm her brother, Gary Snyder.
and we'll never forget April 9th, 1947, as long as we live.
Even though I was only 5 and a half and Marlene was 9 at the time, certain incidents that happened that night made a deep impression on both of us.
That Wednesday evening, our aunt and uncle came by and asked our family to come along with them to the movies. Since it was a school night and Mom and Dad rarely went to the show, they tried to say no.
But, thank God, our uncle was very persistent, and he eventually talked our folks into going.
To see Devil on Wheels.
And incidentally, the movie that was playing at the Woodward Theater that night was Rage in Heaven. And I think now how ironic that is.
When the main feature was over, Gary and I begged to stay and see the cartoon since we missed it at the beginning. During the cartoon, the lights and power began to flicker off and on, and finally went off completely, leaving the theater very dark. Immediately we heard glass breaking outside. People began to panic, and some tried to leave. Some man at the back of the theater shouted, "Everyone go back to your seats and keep calm. It's a cyclone."
Then Mom and Dad grabbed Marlene and I and shoved us under the seats. I remember that I was under the seat nearest the aisle, and the position I was in, I could look right up the aisle to the front doors. I could hear the noise outside, and also pieces of tin were hitting objects so hard they were showering sparks. As kids, we didn't know what the word cyclone meant, but we knew it wasn't good.
It seemed like we were down on the floor for hours, but actually it was only a matter of minutes. When we went outside, it was still stormy. Main Street was littered with debris, and electrical wires were scattered around.
We drove west on Main Street en route to our home at 17th and Madison, dodging debris all the way. We made it as far as the courthouse and couldn't go north because the streets were blocked with too much debris. Our grandfather lived across the street from us, and our dad and uncle brought he and his daughter safely back to the car.
I'll never forget how Grandpa looked. His gray hair was sticking straight up, laced with mud and straw.
They had gone outside during the tornado and had held on to a large tree because objects were flying around inside the house, and he probably felt their chances were better outside. But on reflection, that is the worst thing a person can do in a tornado, and they were very lucky to be alive.
I'll never forget coming into town the next day with my aunt and uncle and seeing the aftermath of the storm. What used to be our house was a scattered pile of rubble. The only thing I can remember finding of my own was my Easter basket. Almost everything we owned was gone.
By the time we got back with the truck, what few items we had salvaged were stolen by looters. The days that followed were grim. Snow had fallen 2 or 3 days after the tornado, and it was cold, damp, and gray. I remember going to funerals, getting typhoid shots, seeing soldiers in the streets, and homeless people.
The tornado left deep emotional scars not only on us, but on each person who was lucky enough to live through it. It seems everyone we knew had loved ones killed or injured, and I'm sure each has his own story. Still yet, 37 years later, when the storm sirens sound, I'm the first one out of the house to head for the cellar.
Others were in the Terry Theater with Marlene and Gary that night.
This is Mrs. Everett Chance. We lived at 324 10th Street at the time of the tornado, and we still live here. And I had taken the 4 children and had went to the Terry Theater to a picture show that night, and it was The Devil's on Wheels. And my husband was working at that time for the MK&T Railroad Company down on 14th Street. And when the tornado had hit, the lights all went out at the theater, and then they came back on and they went off again. And the boy that was in charge of the show that night went down and locked the front door and locked the back door so nobody could leave. He saved many a life that night. And my daughter had just went outside far before that and got some popcorn. And she seen some of the things that happened down on the street. And she came back in and she said, "Mother, you can't imagine what's going on outside." So then when he opened the door, it was all clear. We got outside and we couldn't imagine what in the world had happened. And we walked from the theater, started down Main Street to the Woodward Theater and walked north, and all the way from Main Street to where we lived, there was men along the streets to tell everybody that was walking that there was live wire there and to watch where they stepped. And when we got down to where we lived, we didn't have anything at all sitting there in our place. Our house was all gone, but the foundation, the floor, was on the west side in the road. And my husband was out there digging for us because he didn't know we went to the show that night. And when he seen us, he said, "Thank God you're alive." And we went down to the roundhouse where he had been working. And they had the coaches sitting there at that time. And they brought all the injured people into the passenger coaches, and we tore off the white seat covers and bandaged up as many as we could until the ambulances got down there to take them away to the hospital. The Army brought in army tents, and they set up one out here in our yard for us to live in. And the Salvation Army came in, and we went up to the community building and ate the meals up there. And the Red Cross built back our house and replaced all the furniture that we had lost. And I am very grateful for what the Salvation and the Red Cross and the neighbors all did for us at that time.
2 others that were in the path of the storm recall.
We are a couple, senior citizens and very lucky people. We lived through the Woodward Tornado. We lived at 2209 Kansas. That was in the west end of town, at that time 5 blocks west of the courthouse. 8 people were killed in our block, 2 next door and 2 across the street to the south. 2 children and 4 adults. I feel we were very lucky, for our house stood, just the top was destroyed. None of my family was hurt. My husband was not at home at the time. But when he returned to town, people told him that he could not get home. He found dead ones along the way, but drove home over the debris. To reach us, our children were small, just 6 and 7 years of age. Then he continued with help to pick up the dead and the injured throughout the night. And the next day, it was a terrible night. It rained and it snowed all night. But when the sun came out the next morning, it was so pretty and innocent, as if nothing had happened, and the birds sang. Anything that anyone says about this storm, it was terrible. I feel very lucky to be alive. Frank and Ella Turner.
I'm Jack Welch. When the tornado hit Woodward, I was at the hospital visiting my wife and baby boy. The hospital was out of the path of the tornado, so received minor damages. The lights went out, but we didn't know that a tornado had struck.
I looked out the window to the north and saw a fire. I assumed the power plant was on fire. The only light available was a small flashlight. I volunteered to go to the little drugstore to get flashlights. When I got to Main Street, I realized what had happened. The front of the store was blowing out. Carl Ammerman was in the store but seemed to be in shock. I don't believe he ever knew I took a bunch of flashlights. By the time I got back to the hospital, people were streaming toward the hospital carrying injured people. Shortly, a portable generator was moved to the hospital. Doctors soon started arriving from other towns. By the time the hospital was overflowing with injured people, they were lying in the halls on the floor. I selected the doctor and stayed with him all night. When he finished treating an injured person, I would go in the hall and try to pick out the most critical injured for him to treat. By morning, most had received emergency treatment. I was operating the Woodward Airport, located where the golf course is now located. I went to the airport as soon as it got daylight. 11 planes had been damaged. Airplanes started arriving early, bringing in people wanting to help. By noon, the airport was completely covered with airplanes. People flew in and out in great numbers for several days. It was a great testimony to the concern and goodness of the people. We lost several good friends. All families in Woodward were touched by the results of the tornado.
Still others found their plans disrupted that evening.
I am Mrs. Garnet Thurleen Fry. Live at 1708 Broadmoor. The night the tornado hit Woodward, I was having a ladies' bridge party. There were 8 women and our 2 daughters at my house. Tornado must have hit the minute that we stepped on the basement floor because the terrible pressure lifted. We crouched around the walls, covered our heads with blankets and baskets, and waited for the noise to subside. There were only 4 walls standing. All of the windows had been blown in, and there was a 2x4 run through the crib where I'd picked up my baby just a few minutes before. We were among the fortunate ones who had only monetary loss. We went to tell my parents that we were okay. My father, George Trigo, was mayor at that time. I found out later that they had come by the house and someone that they saw told them that we were all right. So they went to the hospital, and my mother stayed there to help. The next day, the Red Cross arrived in town, and Mother had 11 Red Cross women who bathed and changed and took turns sleeping in their basement for the next few days and nights. My dad had hemorrhaged at the throat, and the doctor had put him to bed, but he wouldn't stay down. And because there were so many decisions to make and so much that had to be done, later Dad was appointed chairman of the board of the Reconstruction Committee.
By April 9th, 1947, Franklin Stetcher, funeral home operator and owner, had been back in Woodward for 2 years. He was also an ambulance driver. Franklin Stetcher picks up our story of the Woodward tornado when we come back after these messages.
Began to blow, and we were on duty that night in the funeral home, and was a terrible wind and noisy, the roar. But I'd never witnessed a tornado before, and we had no warning. I didn't realize what it was, and as you looked out the window, we could see the high-line wires hit the ground and the firefly and the tree limbs go. The building where we were didn't move, though the roof moved above us, but we didn't know that. Just about the time the wind subsided, someone ran in the door and said, "We need an ambulance. There's a car turned over here, and some people hurt." So we went the ambulance out, and the doors of the garage were blown in to where we had to just force them to get the car out. So we drove around the block to where this car was turned over, still not realizing how bad the storm was, because we knew we could see tree limbs and wires down, but we didn't realize what it was. And they picked up, I don't know, 1 or 2 people out of this car wreck and drove out of the path of the storm to the old hospital. Of course, when we got there, we was the first ones there. There could be more, because that was a terrible wind. But I didn't know it. I was telling them the truth. Drove back to the mortuary. Somebody was waiting, said, we need an ambulance over here. And I just went from there, and it wasn't very long till we were down, because we couldn't, the tires were all out on the car, running over the glass and the nails and debris. Why, we had flat tires. Got another car out and could go, and somebody said, well, there's a body here, and they need an ambulance there. And the people began bringing the bodies in their arms, wanting someplace to put them. They brought them in the front door and the back door and laid them on the floor. Later in the evening, why, they'd come and want an ambulance. I'd go to where they were and check them over, and they wasn't hurt too bad. I say, you're better off here than you are at the hospital, because there isn't even room to lay you on the floor. And you have a bed here, you're not going to bleed to death. So you're better here until they can clean out someplace and make a place for you. I advised several that way. By morning, I think at 8 o'clock the next morning, an inventory was taken, and there were 66 dead in the funeral home. It didn't seem like it was any time at all until the ambulance from Clinton was in town. They'd heard it, and they came up really before I realized what was going on. And they told me why the whole west end of town's gone. The man from Clinton, he brought a driver with him. A driver drove the ambulance, and he started embalming. So one time I ran in there, and he said, do you know Sam Snyder? And I said, yes. My brother, I believe he said. And I said, there's his son right there. I just brought him in, got him out of the basement down at the house. And he said, I'll take him next.
The identification of youthful victims had been a real problem, even among the survivors. Some children could tell only part of their names, such as a 3-year-old girl, Willie Mae, at Cripple Children's Hospital. She knew her brother was Tommy and her sister Catherine, and that she had a dog named Spot. In answer to what her daddy did, she said he reads newspapers. And if those who could talk were difficult to name, 3 silent girls in the mortuary would never be identified.
The 3 mystery children, there was no record of anyone of their description missing. One of them, we knew who that was. Her mother was in the Oklahoma City Hospital. She was quite badly mutilated, and we carried her in a blanket into her grandmother, who she had lived with, and grandmother says, well, it looks like her, but I just won't say it is. And the father said, well, if she won't, I won't. But the same name, there's 3 names was placed on her time after time. Her mother's name, her father's name, and her grandmother's name. So we feel that that's who it was. However, they would never claim her. One was approximately a 12-year-old blonde-headed girl that evidently had chewed her fingernails quite badly. It was a habit. And there was no girl like that missing. We even had the school teachers come in with their rosters and say, well, it might be this girl. And someone would go find her. 6-week-old baby that no one ever claimed or even admitted not having.
Some would speculate the storm carried these children from a Texas home, but no one would ever know.
Yeah, this is Dr. Jacobson, night of the tornado. I was out in the country doctoring a cow, and the tornado just followed me home. As soon as I got home, all of a sudden, it sounded just like a freight train full of junk running through town. Several people came, and they told me to bring every bit of suture material. At that time, we had sulfur drugs, and just rush right over to the hospital. Well, when I got there, it was just unbelievable. Well, I wouldn't call it a mess, but it was just injured people lying all over the place, dead people. I came home for a bit to check up on my family, and I found my wife treating a bunch of people. And the thing that struck me the most was there was a complete lack of panic. It was calm. Everybody was calm. It seemed like that night just went in 5 minutes. And then I came home, and there was my family. Oh, well, I still cry when I think how lucky I was. I guess you never do forget that. Then the next day, we went out to look for casualties. And what struck me the most is you can't find the streets. All the houses were in the street. We're going by one blown-down roof, and I looked, and I thought I saw a glove sticking out from under there, and I took another look. It was a hand. I had a jack in my Jeep. We pried up the roof, and underneath it, sure enough, was a elderly man. I'd say he was crushed flat.
Yes, I'm Gail Hurst from out at May, Oklahoma. And the night of the Woodward tornado, I was visiting Roy and Ivy Parks on 14th and Madison. My two children and I was sitting on the divan. We heard this loud noise kind of start cracking. And Mr. Parks said it's a cyclone. And at that time, I laid my two children on the floor and laid over them. And the next thing I knew, the house was gone.
I am Lucille Ray from Chaddick, Oklahoma. Herman had gone to the LLL meeting at the Trinity Lutheran Church located on Oklahoma Avenue. Two sons, Fred, age 10, Gary, 2.5, stayed at home with me. Everything that was loose in the yard, it seemed to be blowing around the house, and it sounded like a freight train coming from the southwest, that terrible roaring sound, crashing and grinding as it kept coming closer. The electricity went off, but earlier I had placed an old kerosene lamp on our dining room table and lit it, as I had a terrible fear of something wrong. The west wall of our dining room suddenly started cracking, swaying in and out. The kerosene lamp was knocked over and went out, leaving the room in darkness. We ran to the kitchen. I couldn't get the west door open, so I broke the glass out with my hands. I wanted to get the boys out, but the wind blew us back. By this time, the stove had broke loose. We ran into it as the house was already moving. The rug seemed to be blown up around us. The floor suddenly started to drop out from under us. Everything seemed to be going down. It was black. Sometime later when I came to, we were laying in the northwest corner of our yard where now the Hillcrest Pharmacy is located at 1603 West Main in Woodward. I still held Gary in my arms, but had lost Fred sometime somewhere during the storm. The black night was lighted only by the bright flashes of lightning. When I saw Fred crawling on hands and knees coming back to us, we couldn't stand up. The wind and debris was so strong and so thick. As we lay there in the rain, we prayed for help. Our home and garage was gone. The trees were stripped, just some broken stumps left. The west kitchen door was later found on the lawn in the front yard of the courthouse. A bedspread was blown in a broken tree east of our house, located at Schaefer and Rose grocery store then. Not much was left. Our old time phonograph was looted by someone. When Herman, Pastor Stenbeck, and wife arrived, we were carried to our car. Pastor stayed to help others, so the rest of us started in on for Shattuck, for the Newman Memorial Hospital. We had 2 flats before reaching there, but drove on into town. Herm got out to fix them, but somehow he just couldn't seem to concentrate on getting them fixed. The hospital was filled when we arrived with people from Higgins and surrounding towns that had already been hit earlier.
It was a girl who was never located that caused the most questions. She was 3-year-old, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Joanne Gay Croft. Her family had lived in the 2100 block of West Main, where her mother was killed and a stepfather seriously injured in the storm. Joanne's stepsister Jerry later reported that Joanne had a leg injury and was taken to the Woodward Hospital the night of the storm. Some people were said to have remembered the 2 sisters that night. According to Jerry and newspapers, 2 men in khaki uniforms came to take Joanne to another hospital. It was not an unusual occurrence, for it had happened often during the next few hours, but Joanne Gay Croft was never seen again. There are several theories as to what had happened to her. She could have been kidnapped. Some say she still lives in Woodward today, probably unaware of her true identity. She may have died in the storm, but authorities were certain she was not one of the unidentified dead girls. The disappearance of Joanne Gay Croft remains the biggest mystery of the Woodward tornado. Her disappearance is a riddle which will perhaps never be solved.
For one young Woodward woman, the Joanne Croft story had special meaning. Wilma Nelson had just moved to Woodward and was living with her roommate in a duplex just south of the old Woodward High School. She had gone to work for Production Credit, where her boss was Hugh C. Jones.
But anyway, when I got back, then Hugh Jones brought us this little girl to keep that was about, I figured, 4 years old. And as I remember, that's what she told us. And, of course, both children had no clothes on when we got them, and were very coated with mud. I think the wind had just stripped them of their clothes. I was out and helped pick up people earlier. But I really just saw people walking around, but I feel like that these children had maybe been, wind blown into mud puddles or something. This little girl was, of course, very frightened, and I sat and held her in a sheet because every time I'd think she'd about dozed off and I was going to put her down while she would wake up crying. But I never could find out who she was. She never would. I'd ask her name, and she didn't remember. And I think, she was just in shock. But I finally got from her that one thing she would say, and it rained hard, and there was lightning and thunder, and when it would thunder, she'd say, "There goes a tater wagon rolling down the hill." I asked her what her daddy did, and I thought it was so cute. She told me he drank beer and read the newspaper. And that was all she would, I would get from her. I tried to wash her in the night when I couldn't see good because, of course, we didn't have any light and all I had was a candle. And she would just scream when I'd try to wash her. So the next morning when it got lighter and we didn't have any water, but luckily we had left some water in our sink where we drained our kitchen, the dishes from supper. And so I tried to rinse her off, and then I could see why she wouldn't let me wash her at the night, because she had little splinters just all over her little body, just like driven into her. Of course, that night she'd been so caked with mud that they didn't really realize when they brought her to me. So I decided the next morning, Mr. Jones and I, that I should take her back up there because she needed some attention. Well, he took me back up there, and I went in, and the nurse, I told her, I said, "This child, I have kept her during the night. I don't know who she belongs to. But I said, she needs medical attention." So she said, "Well, just lay her down there on that cot." There were people everywhere on cots in the lobby of the old hospital. And she said, "We'll get to her as soon as we can." So I sat down there with her, and she was crying and wanting me to hold her. And the nurse said, "Now, you'll have to go on. We don't have room for you to sit here." And so I left with the little girl reaching her arms and crying, and it just broke my heart. Well, when I got back to my apartment, my folks had come from Laverne to see about me. And, of course, I was crying and told Mother, and she says, "You go back down there and see about that little thing." So I took their car, and I went back down there, and I couldn't find her. I never did know who she was, and I've always wondered who the little girl was that I kept. Well, then, later, when there was a little girl missing, they come and quizzed me about her, but I really couldn't describe this little girl all that well because I didn't, really get a good enough look at her without the mud and the stickers and mud in her hair. But she never could tell me a name for herself. I thought that was so strange,
The Woodward Tornado, as told by those who lived it, will continue in a moment. In the Oasis restaurant, Mrs. D.B. Cullen sat with her 5-year-old granddaughter, Karen Lynn Cullen, now Karen Lynn Robb. As the building began to tremble, the child said calmly, "It's time to die, isn't it, grandmother?" Mrs. Agnes Giddens, formerly Agnes Alley, and now of Udall, Kansas, was a waitress in that Oasis steakhouse that evening. Listen carefully as she talks about that night and later another night very similar.
It was early April 1947. 1947. Mother Nature was fighting it out to see who would reign for the following weeks, winter or spring. Everyone was anxious to get out of doors, to get in their gardens, to spruce up their yards. Later that evening, I was at work as a waitress at the Oasis. The telephone strike was on, and I wanted to call my husband, Olin Hutchison, for he and the children had not come over for their usual chat and refreshments before bedtime. Something ominous was in the air. It was getting dark. I wasn't myself. Foul-ups on my orders. Mistakes made. Something was wrong. Why hadn't Olin come over? I went outside, just walked out between orders. The air didn't look right or feel right. A sort of hesitating, pulsating feeling everywhere. The wind was coming up, hot, cold. First from one direction, then another. Lightning flashed from the southwest. Thunder rolled in the distance. Minutes passed. I went back to work, but soon things began to happen. The wind became stronger. Things began to rattle, vibrate, move. Dishes were flying and crashing, tin ripping off the building. Windows ready to explode. I grabbed hold of the front door, for it was opening and closing, banging. Seconds later, the building exploded. I and the door were blown out of the building area. I could hear people screaming, more dishes crashing. The lights were gone. Everything was darker than the inside of a cave, except for an occasional flash of lightning. I was being bounced along as though I were on the moon in zero gravity. I was grasping for something solid to hang on to. I missed a tree, was flailing my arms about, and touched the telephone pole. By this time, the tornado meant business. I held on to the pole with all my strength. I remember being jostled around, for the pole was weaving in a 3-foot circle, routing out the dirt around the pole. I could not hold my mouth shut. My skin crawled all over my face and arms. From the force of the wind, I could not see, hear, or scream. The sound and force of the wind was so terrific that my senses were useless. In minutes, it was all over. The tornado had moved on. But it had, in those few minutes, changed my life forever. I will never forget it. My place of work was gone, as I well knew. I didn't need to worry about finishing the shift, so I started for home, just 2 blocks away. As I groped along over and through the telephone poles, trees, bits of buildings, electric wires, and other debris, I was aware of an unforgettable smell. It was indescribable, like the smell of death. I heard moaning. I touched bare flesh. Someone was on their hands and knees, crawling and crying, "Help me, help me." "Who is this?" I asked. He answered by telling me his name. "Oh," I said, and stumbled on. I had to find my family. I knew there would be no house, no family, but I was hoping they had decided to go to a show and would be spared. Between flashes of lightning, I located our lot. Nothing but a foundation was left. Our house was scattered to the 4 winds. I concluded later from the debris that the house was picked up into the air and exploded after it was airborne, scattering its contents and people in a radius of blocks. Had, in those few minutes, changed my life forever. I will never forget it. My place of work was gone, as I well knew. I didn't need to worry about finishing the shift, so I started for home, just 2 blocks away. As I groped along over and through the telephone poles, trees, bits of buildings, electric wires, and other debris, I was aware of an unforgettable smell. It was indescribable, like the smell of death. I heard moaning. I touched bare flesh. Someone was on their hands and knees, crawling and crying, "Help me, help me." "Who is this?" I asked. He answered by telling me his name. "Oh," I said, and stumbled on. I had to find my family. I knew there would be no house, no family, but I was hoping they had decided to go to a show and would be spared. Between flashes of lightning, I located our lot. Nothing but a foundation was left. Our house was scattered to the 4 winds. I concluded later from the debris that the house was picked up into the air and exploded after it was airborne, scattering its contents and people in a radius of blocks or even miles. The grass, debris, trees, and everything were pointing in a northeasterly direction. So I reasoned my family would be northeast of the house. Approximately a block away, I found all 3. My 2 sons, Rollin, 7, and Jimmy Lee, almost 5, and my husband, Olin L. Hutchison, 32. I checked to see if they were alive. At first, I thought they were. I was screaming for my husband to get up and help me with the kids. He had to be alive. I needed help. He had always helped me, and I needed help now more than I had ever needed it in my life. When no response was forthcoming, I double-checked, and to my horror, all I could hear was the death rattle in his throat. I knew my husband could not help me ever again. I checked my sons again, and I detected a weak pulse in the 5-year-old. My 7-year-old was crying that he was hurting. Oh, God, why? It was beginning to rain. The wind was changing and getting colder. I stood for a moment helpless. Now I knew what a war zone looked like. Trees down or standing at a crazy angle. People crying for help. Others silenced forever. And forever is a long, long time. Again, that eerie smell. Yes, the smell of death all around. It seemed that there was no one else around except the hurt of the dying. Where do I get help? I must find something to cover my family until I could get help. The rain was getting colder. I was shivering. I had no coat. My white uniform wasn't white anymore. I ran. I searched. My mind was racing. What to do? Where to go for help? Would they live? Oh, damn that telephone strike. I tried to call. If I had gotten through, I would have insisted that they come to the oasis. They would have lived through this tornado. I had. Desperately, I needed something dry to cover them. Then I spied a mattress, perhaps my own, who knows. It took time to find it, for one could see only between the lightning flashes. I grabbed it up and ran, yes, ran, with the mattress on my back to my family to cover them from the rain and wind. They were fairly close together when I found them, but I had to drag or carry them and place them close enough together to cover them with the mattress. By then, help could be heard in the distance. I saw a few cars slowly making their way through the debris of the main roadway. I ran approximately a block and asked the people to help. They were looking for someone. They agreed to help me. I ran back to my family, picked up both the children, one in each arm, and took them to the car. I know the 5-year-old had a broken thigh. My help carried my husband to the car. I found out later that my husband had almost every bone in his body broken and a very deep pie-shaped injury to the top of his head. Somehow we arrived at the hospital, but it was already bulging at the seams. People everywhere. The homes nearby were taking in the overflow. Trucks and pickups were coming by to pick up those who had died or were dead when they reached the hospital. My husband was one of them. About 2 hours later, the truck came by again, and I carried my 5-year-old to the pickup. He, too, was gone. Severe head injuries, broken bones, unconscious when I found him. I had stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped him in a blanket that I was given when I arrived at the hospital. I slowly made my way to the pickup, holding my son with nothing but a blanket around him. How can I do this? How can I part with my darling, precious boy, not quite 5 years old? How can I place him in a truck and let them haul him away like cattle? There were other bodies already in the truck. I counted them. I can't remember how many there were. Oh, why can't I wake up from this horrible dream? It has to end sometime before I pass out from the stress of it. The truck was too close. It was time to tend to the living. I placed my son in the truck, and as I did so, someone asked for the blanket wrapped around him. I couldn't believe it. Why? Why? I'll pay you for the damn blanket. How can you do this? I screamed. The voice answered, it won't do him any good. It can't help him now. True, but the blanket is going to stay, I said. And the truck drove away, with the bodies bouncing around in the back of the truck, the tailgate hanging down. I walked back to the house where my remaining son lay. He was still in pain and begging me to help him. There was nothing I could do. He was later taken to another town of Moreland and transported from there by plane to Oklahoma City. The big plane landed in the field south of the hospital. I wasn't even told which hospital he was taken to. I don't remember where I stayed that night. I think it was at the house near the hospital. I think I stayed there until morning, but I was numb for the next 2 weeks. I didn't want to remember. I didn't even cry at the funerals. It was too awful to cry. Death is so final, so irreversible. Later, I remarried, tried to get my life back together, and had 4 more children and moved to Udall, Kansas in 1951. On May 25th, 1955, Udall, Kansas, was blown off the map. Over 80 people killed and many injured. Thankfully, this time, all my family lived through it. But all the old memories came flooding back. Tornadoes have made a believer out of me. To this day, I sleep with the window open and my head as close to the window as possible so I can hear the wind, just in case the wind goes on a rampage again.
While these recollections are not pleasant, they are true stories of horror piled on horror 37 years ago tonight. They must be recorded and remembered, for those that come after us will know how this tornado changed the course of lives on April 9th, 1947. We will be back after this message. On the southeast corner of 18th and Oklahoma was a two-story house where the Mitchell, Gaston, and Reichenberger law firm is today. Two of the Buck Irwin family living at that location would not survive the tornado. Next door, Vera Laban sensed something was wrong.
But by 8 o'clock, I grew more restless and walked the floor, and at 8:30, I woke my niece and said I was going to carry her to the basement. A few hard gusts of wind had hit our heavy front door. We took about 18 steps on the second stairway to the basement when glass started breaking, the windows and the lights went out. I grabbed some matches from a nearby stove, but they're hard to keep lit. The dust was pretty bad and the pressure and noise were terrific. It felt like the whole roof came off, with ripping sounds all around. We found candles and had a light. It got very cold. It had to be a premonition of mine to go to the basement. The sirens and police ambulance began. Our back door opened and our neighbor child cried for help. She said her mother was hurt. She was wet from the rain and her long hair was twisted straight up in a spiral. I took her downstairs and wrapped her in a blanket. My brother-in-law came in screaming Sidney for his daughter. He found we were all okay, so he went next door to see about the woman. My husband called an ambulance for her. Daylight showed us our east door was ripped off and had slammed into the wall right where I had been sitting. The garage was without a roof and no doors. We never found either. My husband's billfold was on a mantelpiece. And a man in Winoka found the picture in his pasture later. Splinters had been struck into our shingle siding of the house, and we were unable to pull him out with pliers. About 18 inches from the ceiling of our living room was a complete circle of mud and water thrown by the tornado. Tumbleweeds and trash were in several rooms.
Meanwhile, Virginia Lowry was a freshman at Woodward High School.
That afternoon, it was very warm, hot, wet wind was blowing from the south, and I remember it was a little sunny, and it was a very warm day. That evening, I had planned to meet my boyfriend after he practiced band, and it began to rain as everyone left. So Dean Story and Bill and I stayed on at the band hut and waited for the rain to leave us. So we were in the band hut. The lights flickered, went out. We rushed to the door. The three of us did. The whole building, the old band hut, was a barrack building, and it moved. You felt like you were in an earthquake or a boat that was rocking heavily, and it moved off its foundation. The walls crashed in, and the big kettle drum tipped over, and I think that's what killed Dean. but it stopped the wall from coming on Bill and I. We were all three there together. Well, we rushed over to Orrin's apartment to get him, and they brought some men in and found Dean dead. We knew he couldn't answer us.
The Dean Story Memorial Fund was started a week later by Basil Martin. The fund was used to repurchase uniforms and lost equipment for the Woodward High School band. While the tornado had left Woodward, it had not yet finished its 220-mile trek. Our last report took place after 10 p.m. from north and west of Alva.
Yes, my name is Lyle Sneary. I live in Alva, Oklahoma. I was a young boy living with my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arlie Sneary, and a younger brother, Gary. We lived approximately 12 miles north and 6.5 miles west of Alva. A tornado struck at approximately 10 minutes after 10 on that evening, and we were in the house. I remember very clearly my mother leaving the bedroom to walk out on the front porch facing south as a few hails were falling. She came back into the bedroom saying the sky was very black, but it didn't look like it was going to do anything. She had no sooner made that utterance until it hit. I remember very clearly the windows exploding. I remember the lath and plaster falling all around us as we were in the southeast bedroom of the house. After about a minute and a half, there came a very still time, at which time we tried to leave that room to go down a hall to a cellar at the back of the house. It again hit one more time with another round of fury that caused more lath, plaster, and debris to be showered upon us. And then, as it became still again, we found our way down what was once a hall and once a kitchen, out through the back of the house into a cellar some 10 feet north of the house. I can clearly remember that my parents worked steadfastly the rest of that night carrying belongings that was left in the shambles of the house into the cellar as it had begun to rain. I can vividly remember some of the things that happened, like a goldfish bowl sitting on a buffet in the living room was still intact, yet most of the water was sucked out of the bowl. I remember an Aladdin lamp sitting on the table with the debris all around it. The ceiling was gone from the house, yet that lamp was sitting there without the globe on it even being...
We asked Dr. Joe Duer to comment on the most significant event that he witnessed 37 years ago tonight.
That's hard to say. It's just pretty terrible sort of situation. After all, I've been in combat, and I'd seen at Iwo Jima, and I'd seen plenty of injuries and wounded and those sort of things. But it was so much different. There were young men, healthy men, and you hated to see them injured and all those sort of things. But then they had an organization. They were trained how to take care of themselves and how to take care of everybody else around them. The whole organization was set up to take care of that type of thing. But here there was no respecter of persons, old people, young people. To see those women and children come in battered up like that you didn't recognize because of the injuries and because of the dirt and the mud on them and those sort of things. I think if there's one, you might say, pleasant sort of a thing that was the fact of the people coming in there. What can I do? What can I do? Everybody wanted to help. That had to stand out as a most memorable thing. Everybody wanted to help and do things.
We will be back with the final portion of our program after this message. Here are the statistics. The Woodward tornado was tracked on the ground for nearly 220 miles from southwest of White Deer, Texas, to just north of the Kansas border, north of Alva, Oklahoma. It was on the ground continuously for nearly 5 hours. Its average speed forward was 45.6 miles per hour. At its widest, it was 1.9 miles across. Its core winds were estimated by the National Weather Service to have ranged from 225 miles per hour to 453 miles per hour at its height. It killed 105 people in Woodward, Oklahoma. It killed 165 people in 2 states. It injured nearly 950 persons. It caused an estimated $11.5 million in property damage. The National Weather Service has never recorded a storm of this intensity.
We have not told the whole story. We have left unsaid the stories of those hundreds who came to help, of money raised, of a community and communities that rebuilt to become even better places to live. These would consume a program all their own. We have had reports from others who were involved. All these tapes will become a part of the permanent collection of recorded tapes at the Woodward Pioneer Museum. For your narrator, Doug Williams, this is Kelly Robinson. This has been a presentation of Omni Communications Corporation, which is solely responsible for its content. Any unauthorized use or rebroadcast of this material is prohibited without the express written consent of Omni Communications Corporation.